It was the summer of '94. I had just turned 18. We lived in a trailer park for my entire childhood, and my mom had decided to move out of town and left the place to me and a cousin of mine. Me and my cousin Sam took a 12-pack of beer down to this little trestle that crossed over a creek that flows right into the Hudson River. So we were drinking and talking, and he goes on to tell me that just the night before, as he was laying on my couch nearly asleep, he was awoken by what sounded like a gunshot that went off right next to his ear. He said he jumped right up and expected everyone in the house to come running out, but no one did. He was the only one who heard it. Now, I didn't know him to be a liar, but I confess I found it difficult to believe what he was saying to me. I wouldn't have even mentioned this part if not for the next series of events. In the middle of our conversation, I noticed way off in the distance something in the sky that I couldn't recognize. Though it was really far away, I could see it wasn't a plane or a helicopter. I was only able to see it for a few seconds though before it got too far away to see it all. So I basically just shrugged my shoulders and forgot about it. We spent the next 3 hours there when we decided to head back home. It was now about 12:30 a.m. It was about a 15-minute walk back, and as we turned the last corner to get to my house, I saw my neighbor and his son, who was the same age as I, standing in the middle of the street looking up into the sky with binoculars. Baffled as to why they were doing so, I looked up, and I'll be damned, maybe a couple 100 feet above my head was a small, completely silent flying saucer. It looked like it could maybe man 4 to 5 people. It had different colored lights around the edges. Flashes of blue, green, red, and yellow blinked in and out. Obviously, I'm completely blown away at the sight of this. We walk over to my neighbor's and just watch this thing hover in the sky. About 10 minutes into all this, it suddenly seemed to notice us. Then it flew directly overhead and began to descend towards us. It came down so low, I'm pretty sure I could have hit it with a stone. I remember starting to feel very nervous as it moved towards us, so much so that I nearly ran. Fight or flight was seconds away from being triggered in my mind. If it had gotten any closer, I most definitely would have ran, but it stopped and just hovered there. It stayed there probably about 10 minutes when it seemed to lose interest in us and slowly began going back up, and it drifted away from us going back towards the river. It continued moving until it was no longer in sight. The whole experience lasted 25 to 30 minutes. All 4 of us began to talk about the experience and made sure we were all in agreement as to what we just saw. It was now after 1 a.m. and we decided to go to bed. So there I am laying in bed. I still had a decent buzz going. I had just witnessed the most amazing thing I had ever seen and was drifting towards sleep. I was probably about 3 seconds away from full sleep when I heard what sounded like a gun go off right next to my ear. I sat right up, eyes wide open and completely awake. I now remember what my cousin had just told me not an hour before. It took me about 2 hours before I could go back to sleep. Over the next few days, little things had begun to happen that we just couldn't explain, mostly having to do with appliances acting strange, turning on and off for no apparent reason. After about a week of this, though, things seemed to quiet down. Both me and Sam got jobs in this bolt factory at the edge of town. I worked the afternoon shift from 3 to midnight, and he worked from midnight to 8 in the morning. So most nights I had the place to myself. About a month went by before things started to get really bad. It all started this one night just after I went to bed. The first night I could hear what sounded like someone trying to quietly walk down my hallway just past my room. I could also hear slight tapping on the walls. It was so faint though that I decided it must have been my cat, so I just went to sleep. The next night was the same thing, but just a little bit louder. Again, I chalked it up to the cat and went to sleep. The night after that, it began to get considerably louder, like someone just walking up and down the hall, hitting the walls. Not really hard, but hard enough where I couldn't blame it on the cat any longer. That night I came out of my room to investigate. There was nothing there. So I just made sure I had locked the door, and for that night the sound stopped. Again, I went to sleep. By the fourth night, when I laid down to go to sleep, I expected to hear something, and it didn't disappoint. Now it sounded like someone running up and down the hall, hitting the walls much harder than the previous nights. Before I went to bed, I had made sure the doors were locked, so I was sure no one was in the house but me. I laid there terrified. After about a half hour or so, the sound stopped, and I was finally able to fall asleep. The next day, I began to tell my friends what happened, but no one believed me. Driving home from work that night, I was actually afraid to go home. This was now the fifth night, and I stayed up much longer than I normally would have. I had to work the next day, though, so I eventually went to bed. The second I laid down, the sounds began. This time it sounded like there were several people running all through the house, knocking things over and just pounding on the walls. It also sounded like they were stomping their feet as hard as they could as they ran around. At this point, I was seriously questioning my sanity. I pulled the covers over my head and laid there in pure terror. I put my hands over my ears, closed my eyes as tight as I could, and somehow eventually fell asleep a couple hours later, and about a half hour after they had stopped. Okay, so here was the last night of this. As soon as I laid down, same thing. What sounded like several people running around the house, just pounding on everything. This time, though, I also heard what sounded like 50 people, all whispering at the same time. I couldn't make out anything they were saying, but I clearly, loudly heard them. Every few minutes, in the middle of the whispers, I could hear what sounded like a woman just laugh out loud. That night my mind was just spinning. I was terrified, but something in me snapped. I just couldn't spend another night allowing this to go on without at least trying to confront it. My bed was very noisy, so as slowly and quietly as I could, I made my way off of it and grabbed this baseball bat that I had across the room. Then, again as quietly as I could, I sat back on the bed contemplating my next move. I had hoped it would just stop, but right then it seemed to get even worse, like they were taunting me to come out. Finally, after sitting there maybe 20 minutes, with rage in my heart, I got up as quick as I could, slammed open the door, and started running through the house, turning lights on as fast as I could. And I was ready to beat the living hell out of the first thing I saw. I searched every corner, every closet, every inch. There was nothing there. Those types of nights ended right then. There were still some pretty messed up things that had happened after all this, but that was the height of my experience. By the way, my cousin Sam, who lived with me, some years later killed himself with a shotgun. I always wondered if him hearing this sound that night was related to his eventual death.